The forest exploded with the sound of snapping branches as Damien Ashford tore through the dark trees, his massive black wolf form cutting through shadows like a blade through water. Somewhere ahead, a small cry rang out, sharp and frightened, and every muscle in his body screamed to move faster. His son was out there. His son was in danger, and nothing in this world, not even his own life, mattered more than reaching him in time. Branches whipped against his fur. His paws tore into the wet earth. The scent of blood, faint but growing stronger, pulled him forward like a rope tied around his heart. Behind him, 3 of his best warriors struggled to keep pace, but Damien did not wait for them. He could not wait. Not when Eli's voice still echoed in his mind, small and broken, calling out for help just minutes before the connection between father and son had gone terrifyingly silent. He burst into a clearing and skidded to a stop, chest heaving, eyes scanning every shadow. A group of rogue wolves stood near the tree line, teeth bared, eyes glowing with hunger and violence. And there, crouched behind a fallen log, trying to make himself as small as possible, was a 4-year-old boy with messy brown hair and wide, terrified eyes. Eli. Damien's growl rumbled through the clearing like distant thunder. In one motion, he shifted back into his human form, standing tall and shirtless in the cold night air, his eyes burning gold with the fury of the Alpha King. The rogue wolves hesitated. They knew that stare. Every wolf in the region knew what it meant to stand in front of Damien Ashford when his son's life was on the line. "Get away from him," Damien said, his voice low and steady, carrying the weight of command that came from years of ruling the Blackthorn pack without mercy for those who threatened what belonged to him. The rogues exchanged glances, calculating whether the child was worth the risk. It took only 3 seconds for them to decide it was not. They turned and fled into the darkness, disappearing as quickly as they had come, leaving behind nothing but broken branches and the fading echo of their footsteps. Damien rushed to his son, dropping to his knees in the mud without a second thought for his own dignity. Eli threw himself into his father's arms, small hands gripping tightly to his neck, his whole body trembling. "I got lost," Eli whispered between sobs. "I just wanted to see the flowers by the river. I didn't mean to wander so far." Damien held him close, his heart still pounding from the fear that had gripped him only moments earlier. He said nothing at first, simply breathing in the familiar scent of his son, reminding himself that Eli was safe, that Eli was alive, that the worst had not happened tonight. But as he carried Eli back toward the pack house, his mind could not stop replaying the moment he realized his son was missing. It had happened so fast. One moment Eli was playing near the training grounds under the watch of a guard, and the next moment he was gone, having slipped away while everyone's attention had been elsewhere. It was not the first time something like this had happened. Eli had a habit of wandering, of searching for something he could never quite name, and Damien knew exactly why. His son was lonely. 3 years had passed since the night Damien lost his mate, Elena, during childbirth. 3 years of trying to be both mother and father to a boy who deserved so much more than a household run by grief and duty. Damien had built high walls around his heart in the aftermath of her death, walls so thick that even his own son sometimes struggled to reach him. He told himself it was necessary. An Alpha King could not afford to be weak. He could not afford to let anyone else close enough to hurt him, the way losing Elena had hurt him. But watching Eli cling to him now, still shaking from his fright, Damien understood with painful clarity that his walls were not just protecting him. They were also keeping his son from the warmth he desperately needed. When they reached the pack house, healers rushed forward to check Eli for injuries, though thankfully, he had only scrapes and bruises from his tumble through the forest. Damien stood in the hallway afterward, staring at nothing, his hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline that had not yet left his body. "You cannot keep doing this alone," said Owen, his beta and closest friend since childhood, appearing beside him with 2 cups of untouched tea neither of them would drink. "The boy needs more than guards watching him from a distance. He needs someone who understands him, someone who is actually there." "I am there," Damien said, though even to his own ears the words sounded hollow. Owen gave him a look that needed no words to convey his doubt. "You are there in body, but Eli needs more than a father who provides for him. He needs warmth. He needs someone who will sit with him, talk with him, understand the things he cannot say out loud. You cannot give him that right now, Damien." Not while you are still buried under everything you refuse to let go of. Damien did not answer. He knew Owen was right, but knowing something and being able to change it were two very different things. Grief did not simply disappear because logic demanded it. It lived in him quietly, a constant companion that shaped every decision, every silence, every distance he kept from those who tried to get close. That night, after tucking Eli into bed and staying until his son's breathing evened into sleep, Damien sat alone in his study, staring at a portrait of Elena that hung above the fireplace. Her eyes seemed to look back at him with the same gentle patience she always carried in life, as if she understood the storm inside him even now. "He needs someone," Damien whispered to the empty room, "and I do not know how to be that person anymore." The following morning, the pack house was thrown into chaos when the elderly nanny who had cared for Eli since infancy announced her retirement, citing her failing health and the demands of caring for an active young boy who required far more attention than she could safely provide. Damien understood her decision, but the timing could not have been worse. The Alpha Council had already been pressing him for weeks about finding a proper Luna for the pack, insisting that a kingdom without a queen was a kingdom vulnerable to instability. Now, without even a nanny to help manage his son's daily needs, the pressure only intensified. "You need help," Owen said again that afternoon, standing in the doorway of Damien's office with a stack of scrolls under his arm. "And before you say it, no, I am not talking about the Council's endless suggestions of Luna candidates. I am talking about someone to care for Eli, someone patient, someone kind." Damien rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of a headache building behind his eyes. "Do you have someone in mind, or are you simply here to remind me of problems I already know exist?" Owen smiled slightly, the kind of smile that suggested he had been waiting for this exact question. "As a matter of fact, I do. There is a young woman staying on the outskirts of our territory. A rogue wolf. No pack affiliation, but she has been helping the healers with the younger pups in the village for the past few weeks. The children adore her. She has a way about her, calm and steady, the kind of presence that makes even the most stubborn pup listen." "A rogue," Damien repeated, his tone flat. Rogue wolves were viewed with suspicion by most established packs. Wolves without a home, often assumed to be dangerous or unreliable, simply because they did not belong anywhere. The pack elders would not approve of a rogue caring for the future heir of Blackthorn. "Her name is Callie," Owen continued, undeterred by Damien's hesitation. "She lost her pack years ago and has been on her own since. But Damien, I have watched her with the children. She is gentle in a way that cannot be taught. If anyone could reach Eli, it might be her." Damien considered this for a long moment, weighing the risk against his son's obvious need. He thought of Eli's tear-streaked face in the forest the night before, the way his small body had trembled with fear and loneliness combined. He thought of the walls he could not seem to bring down himself, no matter how much he wished he could for his son's sake. "Bring her to me," he said finally. "I will speak with her myself." That evening, as the sun dipped low over the Blackthorn territory, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple, Callie Reyes stood outside the grand doors of the pack house, her heart hammering nervously in her chest. She had heard stories about Alpha King Damien Ashford, tales of a fierce and unyielding leader who ruled with an iron will and had not smiled since the death of his mate. She had never imagined she would find herself standing at his doorstep, let alone being considered for a position within his own household. She smoothed down the front of her simple dress, a nervous habit she had carried since childhood, and took a steadying breath. Whatever happened inside those doors, she reminded herself that she had faced far harder things in her life than a stern conversation with an intimidating alpha. She had survived losing everything once already. She could survive this. A guard led her through long corridors lined with portraits of past alphas and Lunas, their painted eyes seeming to follow her as she walked. Finally, she was brought to a large study, where Damien Ashford stood by the window, his back to her, staring out at the training grounds below. "You must be Callie," he said without turning around, his deep voice filling the room with quiet authority. "Yes, Alpha," she replied, keeping her tone respectful but steady. She refused to let her nerves show, even though her hands had begun to tremble slightly at her sides. Damien finally turned to face her, and for a moment, something flickered across his expression, something she could not quite name. Surprise, perhaps, or curiosity. She was not what he had expected. There was no arrogance in her posture, no attempt to impress him with false confidence. Just quiet strength and genuine warmth in her eyes, the kind of warmth that seemed to exist despite whatever hardships had shaped her life, rather than because her life had been easy. "Owen tells me you have experience caring for young pups," Damien said, studying her carefully. "I do," Callie answered. "I have helped in the village for several weeks now. Children trust easily when they feel safe. I try to make sure they feel that, especially the ones who have had difficult starts in life." Something in her words struck a chord within Damien, though he could not explain exactly why. Perhaps it was the simple honesty in her voice, so different from the careful, calculated words most people used when speaking to him. Perhaps it was the way she looked him directly in the eyes, without flinching, without the fear or ambition he usually saw reflected back at him. "My son," Damien said slowly, choosing his words with care, "has had a difficult few years. He struggles with loneliness. He wanders, searching for something he cannot articulate. I need someone who can be patient with him, someone who can give him the warmth he needs, warmth that I have not always been able to provide myself." Callie's expression softened, genuine sympathy replacing the nervousness that had gripped her only moments before. "Grief changes how we love the people around us sometimes," she said gently. "It does not mean the love is not there. It simply means it is buried under something heavy." Damien stared at her, momentarily unable to respond. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken to him with such quiet understanding, without judgment, without trying to fix him or push him toward healing on their own timeline. She simply saw him, saw the weight he carried, and acknowledged it, without demanding anything in return. "Will you meet him?" Damien asked finally, his voice softer than it had been moments before. Callie nodded. "I would like that very much." They walked together to the private garden behind the pack house, where Eli was playing quietly by himself near a small pond, tossing pebbles into the water, and watching the ripples spread outward in slow, expanding circles. He looked up as they approached, his small face curious but guarded, the caution of a child who had learned that new faces did not always stay. "Eli," Damien said gently, kneeling down beside his son, "this is Callie. She is going to be spending some time with you, if that is all right with you." Eli studied her for a long moment, his amber eyes so much like his father's, searching her face for something only he could recognize. Then, slowly, hesitantly, he held out one of the smooth pebbles he had been collecting. "Do you want to throw one?" he asked quietly. Callie knelt down in the grass beside him, accepting the pebble with a gentle smile. "I would love to," she said. "Show me how you do it." As Eli demonstrated his technique with surprising seriousness for a 4-year-old, explaining the proper angle and force needed to make the water ripple just right, Damien stood back and watched, something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. It had been so long since he had seen his son this animated, this willing to open up to someone new. Whatever walls Eli usually kept around himself, walls built from years of losing people and being handed off between caretakers, seemed to lower just slightly in Callie's presence. That night, after Callie had gone, and Eli was finally asleep, exhausted from an afternoon of laughter that had felt foreign in the pack house for far too long, Damien found himself standing outside his son's bedroom door, listening to the quiet, peaceful sound of his breathing. For the first time in longer than he could remember, the house did not feel quite so empty. He did not yet understand what this meant, or where this unexpected warmth might lead him. He only knew that something had shifted, subtle but undeniable, the moment Callie Reyes had knelt down in the grass beside his son, and treated him not as the future Alpha King, not as a burden requiring careful management, but simply as a lonely little boy who deserved someone's full attention. As Damien walked back to his own quarters that night, his mind lingered on the memory of Callie's gentle voice, her patient eyes, the way she had spoken to him about grief with such quiet wisdom. He told himself it meant nothing beyond finding suitable care for his son. He told himself the strange warmth in his chest was simply relief, nothing more. But deep within him, in a place he had kept locked away since the night he lost Elena, something had begun, ever so quietly, to stir awake. The next morning arrived with a soft golden light spilling through the tall windows of the pack house, and for the first time in months, Damien woke without the heavy dread that usually settled over him the instant his eyes opened. He lay still for a moment, listening to the distant sound of birds outside, and found himself thinking, unexpectedly, of the way Callie had laughed the day before, when Eli splashed water onto her sleeve. It was a small, ordinary memory, yet it lingered in his mind with strange persistence. He rose and dressed quickly, eager, though he would not have admitted it aloud, to see whether his son's brightened mood had carried through the night. When he reached the dining hall, he found Eli already seated at the table, swinging his legs happily as he ate his breakfast, chatting animatedly to no one in particular about the shapes the ripples had made in the pond. "You seem happy this morning," Damien said, taking his seat across from his son. "Callie is coming back today," Eli announced, as though this fact alone explained everything. "She said she would teach me how to skip stones properly. Not just throw them, skip them, like they fly across the water." Damien felt the corner of his mouth lift, an unfamiliar sensation after so long. "Is that so?" "She knows lots of things," Eli continued, undeterred by his father's quiet amusement. "She told me about the stars too. She said every star used to be someone's wish, and that is why they still shine, because wishes never really go out." Something about the simplicity of the words struck Damien harder than he expected. He thought of Elena, of the nights she used to point out constellations to him before Eli was born, back when the future still felt bright and uncomplicated. He wondered whether Callie had known such stories from her own childhood, or whether she had simply invented them on the spot to bring comfort to a boy who needed comforting. Later that day, as promised, Callie returned to the pack house, and Damien found himself lingering near the garden longer than necessary, telling himself it was simply prudent to observe how she interacted with his son before fully entrusting her with his care. He stood beneath the shade of an old oak tree, watching as Callie knelt beside Eli at the edge of the pond, patiently guiding his small hand through the motion of a proper throw. "You have to let it go flat," she explained gently, demonstrating with her own wrist. "Not straight down, sideways, like you are skipping it across the top of the water." Eli tried several times, each attempt sending the pebble plunking straight down, with an unceremonious splash. He huffed in frustration, his small shoulders slumping, but Callie only laughed softly and squeezed his shoulder. "Everyone misses before they get it right," she told him. "Even me. It took me a whole summer to learn this when I was your age." "Really?" Eli asked, his eyes widening. "Really," Callie confirmed. "My father taught me. We used to go down to the river near our old home every evening after his work was finished, and he would not let me go inside for dinner until I managed at least one good skip." There was a wistfulness in her voice as she spoke, a quiet sorrow beneath the fondness, and Damien, still watching from beneath the oak tree, found himself wondering about the family she had lost, the home she no longer had. He knew only fragments of her story from what Owen had told him, but standing there watching her patient tenderness with his son, he began to understand that whatever hardship had shaped her, it had not hardened her heart. If anything, it seemed to have made her gentler, more attuned to the pain of others. Eli tried again, and this time the pebble skipped once across the surface before sinking beneath the water. His face lit up with pure delight, and he spun around to see if his father had witnessed his success. "Papa, did you see that? I did it!" "I saw," Damien called back, stepping out from beneath the tree's shade, unable to hide the genuine warmth in his voice. "Well done." Eli ran to him, wrapping his arms around his father's legs in an enthusiastic hug, before darting back to the water's edge to try again, eager to repeat his success. Damien watched him go, then turned his gaze to Callie, who was watching the exchange with a soft, unguarded smile. "Thank you," Damien said quietly, closing the distance between them. "I have not seen him this happy in a very long time." "He is a wonderful boy," Callie replied. "He just needed someone to remind him that it is all right to be happy, even when there is sadness underneath it. Children carry more than we sometimes realize." Damien studied her for a long moment, struck again by the depth of understanding in her words. "You speak as though you know this from experience." Callie's smile faltered slightly, though she did not look away. "I do," she admitted simply, offering no further explanation, and Damien, sensing the boundary she had drawn around that particular pain, did not press her for more. He recognized the instinct all too well. He carried the same boundaries around his own grief. As the afternoon stretched into evening, Damien found himself remaining in the garden far longer than he had originally intended, watching his son laugh and play with a lightness he had feared might never return. When it finally came time for Callie to leave, Eli clung to her hand, reluctant to let her go. "Will you come back tomorrow?" he asked, his voice small and hopeful. Callie knelt down to his level, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead with practiced gentleness. "I will come back every day, if your father will have me," she said, glancing up at Damien with a question in her eyes. "Yes," Damien said, the word coming out more quickly and more certainly than he had planned. "Please, come back tomorrow." That night, as Damien sat once again in his study, staring at the portrait of Elena above the fireplace, he found that the familiar ache in his chest had softened, just slightly, replaced by something he had not expected to feel again: hope. Fragile and uncertain, but hope nonetheless. He did not yet understand what it meant, or what it might grow into, but he knew that something important had begun, the moment Callie Reyes had walked through the doors of his pack house, and he found himself, for the first time in 3 long years, curious to see what tomorrow might bring. Weeks passed, and the pack house that had once felt like a quiet, echoing shell slowly began to fill with sound again. Laughter drifted through the hallways in the late afternoons. The kitchen staff grew accustomed to the sight of Callie, sitting at the long wooden table, helping Eli with his letters, or listening patiently as he told elaborate stories about imaginary adventures through the forest. Even the guards, initially wary of a rogue wolf walking freely through the pack grounds, had softened toward her, charmed by her quiet kindness and the obvious devotion she showed toward the young heir. Damien told himself, again and again, that his growing awareness of her was simply gratitude. She had given his son something he had not been able to provide himself, and it was only natural that he would feel warmly toward the person responsible for such a change. But gratitude did not explain the way his chest tightened pleasantly whenever he heard her laughter drifting from the garden. It did not explain why he found himself inventing reasons to walk past the places she and Eli spent their afternoons, or why he lingered in doorways longer than necessary just to catch glimpses of the easy warmth between them. One afternoon, as autumn began to paint the leaves in shades of amber and rust, Damien returned from a long meeting with the Alpha Council to find the garden unusually quiet. He frowned, expecting to hear Eli's chatter or Callie's gentle voice, but instead found only silence. Concern quickened his steps as he moved through the pack house, and he finally found them in the small library, tucked into the window seat together, a large picture book open across both their laps. Eli had fallen asleep against Callie's shoulder, his small chest rising and falling in peaceful rhythm, one hand still resting on the open page of the book. Callie sat perfectly still, careful not to disturb him, her fingers gently combing through his hair in slow, soothing strokes. She looked up when Damien entered, offering a soft smile and pressing a finger to her lips in a silent request for quiet. Damien crossed the room carefully, lowering himself into the chair across from them, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. He simply watched his son sleeping peacefully, watched the tender way Callie held him, and felt something inside his chest loosen that had been tightly wound for 3 long years. He fell asleep in the middle of the story, Callie whispered eventually, her voice barely above a breath. I did not have the heart to wake him. You do not have to whisper, Damien said softly. He sleeps deeply once he is out. A thunderstorm would not wake him now. Callie smiled, glancing down at the sleeping boy with obvious fondness. He is a remarkable child, so curious about everything. He asked me today why the moon does not fall out of the sky. What did you tell him? I told him the moon is held in place by something stronger than gravity, something that does not let go, even when it cannot be seen. She paused, her gaze lifting to meet Damien's. He told me that sounded like love. I did not correct him. Damien felt his throat tighten unexpectedly at her words. He thought of Elena, of the love that had once held their small family together, and of the love he still carried for her even now, invisible but unbreakable, exactly as Callie had described. He thought, too, of the strange new warmth that had begun growing in him since Callie's arrival, and wondered, not for the first time, what exactly it meant. You are very good with him, Damien said finally, his voice rougher than he intended. Better than I ever expected when Owen first suggested hiring you. He makes it easy, Callie replied. He simply wants to be loved, the same as any child. He does not ask for anything complicated, and yet I have struggled to give him even that these past years, Damien admitted, the confession slipping out before he could stop it. He rarely spoke so openly to anyone. But something about the quiet intimacy of the library, the soft evening light falling across Callie's face, loosened words that usually remained locked behind careful walls. I have been so consumed by grief and duty that I forgot how to simply sit with him, how to just be his father, rather than his king. Callie was quiet for a moment, studying him with an expression that held no judgment, only gentle understanding. Grief does not erase love, she said softly. It only buries it for a while. But I think, watching you these past weeks, that your love for him was never truly gone. It was simply waiting for you to find your way back to it. Damien met her eyes, struck once again by the quiet wisdom she carried, wisdom that seemed to come not from books or teachings, but from hard-won experience. How did you become so wise about grief, Callie? Her expression shifted, a shadow passing briefly across her features before she carefully smoothed it away. I have had a great deal of practice carrying it myself, she said simply, and once again, Damien recognized the boundary in her words and chose not to push further. Eli stirred slightly in his sleep, murmuring something unintelligible before settling back into peaceful stillness, and the moment between them softened into something quieter, something that did not require further words. Damien rose eventually, gently lifting his son into his arms to carry him to bed, and as he did, Callie stood as well, straightening the picture book and placing it carefully back on its shelf. Thank you, Damien said again at the library door. Eli's sleeping weight settled comfortably against his shoulder. For everything you have given him, and for reminding me what I nearly forgot. Callie's smile in that moment was soft and genuine, reaching all the way to her eyes. You are welcome, Alpha. Damien, he corrected quietly. When it is just us, you may call me Damien. Something flickered across her face, surprise mixed with something warmer, and she nodded slowly. Damien, she repeated, testing the name softly, as though tasting something new and unexpected. As the weeks continued to pass, this pattern of quiet closeness deepened between them, small moments accumulating like stones, building toward something larger, neither of them dared to name aloud. Damien found himself seeking her out more often, not simply to check on Eli's well-being, but because her presence had become, without his fully realizing it, a source of comfort he had not known he still needed. But not everyone in the pack watched this growing bond with approval. Among the older pack members and the more traditional members of the Alpha Council, whispers had already begun to circulate, questioning why a rogue wolf with no lineage, no proper training, and no claim to nobility had been given such intimate access to the future heir of Blackthorn. Margaret, one of the most influential elders on the council, voiced her concerns openly during a private meeting with Damien one crisp autumn morning. The boy grows more attached to her by the day, Margaret said, her tone carefully measured, but her disapproval evident beneath the polished words. It is one thing to employ her as a temporary caretaker, Alpha. It is quite another to allow such closeness to continue unchecked. What happens when the council finally selects a proper Luna for this pack? Will young Eli simply transfer his affections, or will we have created a painful attachment that serves no one well in the long run? Damien's jaw tightened at her implication, though he kept his expression carefully neutral, the same discipline that had served him well through years of leadership. Eli's happiness is not a political calculation, Margaret. He is a child who lost his mother before he could even remember her face. If he has found comfort with someone who cares for him genuinely, I will not take that away from him simply to satisfy tradition. And what of the pack's stability? Margaret pressed. A kingdom without a proper Luna grows vulnerable, Alpha. Rival packs already whisper about Blackthorn's weakened position. We need a Luna of proper standing, someone who can strengthen our alliances and secure our future. Not a rogue with no pack of her own. Damien said nothing for a long moment, his thoughts drifting unbidden to Callie's gentle laughter, to the peaceful sight of his son sleeping against her shoulder, to the quiet warmth that had begun to fill rooms she occupied. He did not yet understand what these feelings meant, or where they might lead him, but he found himself unwilling, in that moment, to dismiss them, simply because tradition demanded it. I hear your concerns, Margaret, he said finally, his tone leaving no room for further argument. But I will not make decisions about my son's happiness, or my own household, based solely on political convenience. When the time comes to discuss the future of this pack's leadership, we will discuss it properly. Until then, I ask that the council allow me to manage my own family in peace." Margaret's expression tightened with obvious displeasure, but she said nothing further, offering only a stiff nod before excusing herself from his study. Damien remained standing by the window long after she had gone, staring out over the training grounds where, in the distance, he could just make out the small figures of Eli and Callie walking together near the tree line. Eli's hand tucked trustingly into hers, his head tilted up as he chattered about something that made Callie throw her head back, in genuine laughter. Damien watched them for a long while, something warm and unfamiliar settling deep in his chest, and found himself wondering, despite every warning bell his careful, grief-hardened mind tried to sound, whether perhaps the council's concerns about attachment applied not only to his son. The great hall of the Blackthorn pack house had been transformed for the occasion, long tables draped in deep blue cloth, silver lanterns hanging from the rafters, and the scent of roasted meat and fresh bread filling every corner of the vast room. It was the autumn gathering, a tradition held every year to honor the harvest and reaffirm the bonds between the Alpha King and every family within his territory. Wolves from every corner of Blackthorn had traveled to attend, filling the hall with 100 conversations, laughter, and the occasional burst of music from the small group of musicians stationed near the far wall. Damien stood near the head table, dressed in formal dark clothing that marked his position without excess, greeting pack members as they arrived, exchanging brief words of welcome, listening to updates on harvests and family matters, with the patient attentiveness expected of him. It was exhausting work, the kind of performance that required constant vigilance, but he had performed it every year of his reign, and he would perform it again tonight without complaint. Across the hall, he could see Eli standing near Callie, dressed in a small, formal outfit that made him look strangely grown up, his hair combed neatly for once instead of its usual wild disarray. Callie wore a simple dress the color of autumn leaves, her hair pulled back in a loose braid, and even from this distance, Damien found his eyes drawn to her more often than he cared to admit. Lady Seraphina had arrived only an hour earlier, sweeping into the hall with an entourage befitting her status, as the daughter of one of the most powerful allied packs in the region. She was beautiful in the polished, practiced way of nobility, every movement calculated for maximum effect, and she had made her intentions toward Damien clear from the moment of her arrival, gliding to his side with a confidence that assumed welcome. "The hall looks magnificent, Alpha," Seraphina said, her hand resting lightly on his arm in a gesture that felt more possessive than friendly. "Though I confess, I am surprised to see the young heir's caretaker mingling so freely among the guests. Is that not usually a role kept to the background?" Damien's jaw tightened at the subtle jab, but he kept his expression neutral, long practiced at concealing irritation behind diplomatic calm. "Callie has become an important part of my son's life," he said simply. "She is welcome at any gathering in this hall." Seraphina's smile did not waver, though something sharp flickered briefly in her eyes, before she smoothed it away. "Of course, Alpha. I meant no offense." The evening continued, the hall filling with warmth and celebration, as course after course was served. Toasts were raised in honor of the harvest, and children ran between tables in games of their own invention. Eli, growing restless after sitting through the formal opening of the feast, slipped away from his seat beside his father to join a group of pack children playing near the edge of the hall, their laughter rising above the general din of conversation. Damien watched him go, with quiet fondness, grateful to see his son so easily included among the other children, a stark contrast to the isolated, withdrawn boy he had been only months before. Callie, seated nearby, watched as well, her expression soft, with the same quiet pride Damien felt. The children's game grew more energetic, a chase involving several pups darting between tables and around the legs of amused adults, until Eli, running at full speed to avoid being caught, misjudged the distance to an overturned bench and went tumbling to the ground with a sharp cry of surprise and pain. The hall's cheerful noise faltered instantly, heads turning toward the sound. Damien was on his feet immediately, his heart lurching with the same instinctive fear that had gripped him the night Eli went missing in the forest. But before he could take more than 2 steps, he saw his son scramble upright, tears already welling in his eyes from the sting of a scraped palm, and run, without hesitation, directly toward Callie. "Mom," Eli cried out, his voice small but carrying clearly through the sudden hush that had fallen over the gathered crowd. "Mom, it hurts." The word landed in the hall like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward in waves of stunned silence. Every conversation stopped. Every eye turned, first toward the small boy now buried in Callie's embrace, his face pressed against her shoulder, and then, inevitably, toward Damien, standing frozen near the head table, waiting, as everyone in that hall was waiting, to see how their Alpha King would respond to such a public, undeniable mistake. Callie's entire body had gone rigid with shock, her arms instinctively wrapping around Eli even as her wide eyes lifted to find Damien's across the crowded hall, silently apologizing, silently asking what she should do, whether she should correct the boy immediately or wait for guidance from his father. She had never once, in all her weeks caring for Eli, encouraged such a title. She had been careful, so careful, to maintain the boundary of caretaker, aware always of her uncertain position within the pack. But grief and instinct did not follow careful boundaries, and in his moment of pain, Eli had reached for the only comfort his heart knew to seek. Margaret, seated near the front of the hall, drew in a sharp, audible breath, her eyes narrowing with something between vindication and outrage. Seraphina's expression, carefully composed only moments before, tightened into something cold and calculating, her gaze fixed intently on Damien, waiting to see whether he would embarrass himself further by allowing such a claim to stand unchallenged. The entire hall seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Damien crossed the distance slowly, his footsteps the only sound in the otherwise silent room, every eye tracking his approach. He knelt down beside his son, gently examining the scraped palm that had prompted such tears, his large hands surprisingly tender as he checked for any serious injury. "Just a scrape," he said softly, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by those nearest. "You will be all right." Eli sniffled, still clinging tightly to Callie's dress, his small face turned up toward his father, with the open, unguarded trust of a child who had not yet learned to fear judgment. "It really hurts, Papa." "I know," Damien said gently, "but you were very brave." The moment stretched, every noble and elder in the hall waiting for the correction that tradition demanded, the clarification that would restore proper order, that would remind everyone present, especially the rogue wolf kneeling beside the young heir, of her actual place within this household. Margaret leaned forward slightly in her seat, certain that Damien would not allow such an error to pass without comment, not in front of the entire pack, not in front of Seraphina and the visiting nobility who had come specifically to evaluate the stability of Blackthorn's leadership. But Damien said nothing. He reached out instead and gently brushed a strand of hair from his son's forehead, the same tender gesture Callie so often used, and rose to his feet without a single word of correction, without so much as a glance toward Callie that might suggest embarrassment or disapproval. He simply turned, lifted Eli into his arms, despite the boy being nearly too old for such carrying, and addressed the silent hall with the calm authority of a man who owed no one an explanation for his family's private matters. "Let the celebration continue," he said, his voice steady and final, leaving absolutely no room for further discussion. "My son has had a small tumble, nothing more." Slowly, hesitantly, the hall's usual noise began to return, conversations resuming in hushed, curious tones, though every glance that drifted toward Damien carrying his son, with Callie following close behind them, carried the weight of unspoken questions that would not remain unspoken for long. Whispers had already begun spreading like wildfire between tables, guests leaning close to murmur speculation to their neighbors, eyes tracking every subtle interaction between the Alpha King and the quiet rogue woman who had, without any formal claim or ceremony, just been called mother by the future heir of Blackthorn, in front of the entire pack. Callie followed Damien out of the main hall toward a quieter side room, her heart pounding with a mixture of panic and confusion that made it difficult to think clearly. The moment the door closed behind them, muffling the distant sound of the feast continuing without them, she turned to Damien, her expression stricken with worry. "I am so sorry," she said quickly, the words tumbling out before he could speak. "I never encouraged him to call me that. I have been so careful, Damien, I swear to you. I never once suggested such a thing. I understand if this creates problems for you, if the council—" "Callie," Damien interrupted gently, setting Eli down carefully on a nearby chair where the boy sat quietly, still sniffling, but calming under his father's steady presence. "Stop." She fell silent, watching him with wide, anxious eyes, waiting for whatever judgment he intended to deliver. "You have nothing to apologize for," Damien said, his voice low and sincere. "Children speak from their hearts, before they learn to filter their words through caution." Eli did not make a mistake tonight. He simply said what he feels, without pretense, without fear of what others might think. "But the council," Callie began, "and Lady Seraphina, and everyone in that hall, will think whatever they wish to think," Damien said firmly. "I answer to my own judgment, Callie, not to gossip whispered between courses at a harvest feast." He paused, studying her carefully, weighing words he had not planned to say aloud so soon, if ever. "And perhaps," he added, more quietly now, "he did not say something entirely wrong." Callie's breath caught, her eyes searching his face for meaning, uncertain whether she had understood him correctly. Before she could ask him to clarify, Eli, still perched on the chair between them, wiped his eyes and looked between the two adults with the simple, unclouded logic of a child. "Are you two going to be mad at each other now?" he asked, genuine worry creeping into his small voice. Both Damien and Callie turned to him at once, and despite the tension still humming beneath the surface of the moment, something in the boy's earnest concern broke through, softening the air between them. "No," Damien said gently, kneeling down to meet his son's eyes. "No one is mad, Eli, not at you, and not at Callie." Eli seemed to accept this answer easily, the resilience of childhood already moving past the incident that had frozen an entire hall of adults into stunned silence only minutes before. But for Damien and Callie, standing together in the quiet side room, while the distant sounds of the feast continued beyond the closed door, the moment lingered heavily between them, unspoken questions hanging in the air, waiting for a future neither of them yet knew how to name. Outside that room, in the great hall filled with lingering whispers and curious glances, the pack of Blackthorn had already begun writing their own story about what they had witnessed that night, a story that would spread through the territory in the days to come, reaching ears far beyond the hall's walls, reaching, eventually, ears that would not receive the news kindly at all. By the following morning, the story of the harvest feast had already traveled far beyond the walls of the great hall, carried from household to household by servants, guards, and pack members, eager to share what they had witnessed. In every corner of Blackthorn territory, the same question was being whispered over breakfast tables and market stalls alike. Why had the Alpha King not corrected the boy? Why had he allowed a rogue wolf, a woman with no lineage, no pack of her own, to stand unchallenged in a role that belonged, by every tradition the pack held sacred, to a proper Luna? Callie felt the weight of those whispers the moment she stepped outside the small cottage she rented at the edge of the village. Where once the pack members had greeted her with polite nods or friendly smiles, grateful for her help with their own children, now she found herself met with sidelong glances and hushed conversations that stopped abruptly whenever she drew near. The baker's wife, who had always saved her the good bread from the morning batch, suddenly seemed too busy to meet her eyes. Two young mothers she had befriended in the village square crossed to the opposite side of the road as she approached, murmuring to each other behind raised hands. By midday, the weight of it had settled into her chest like a stone, heavy and unyielding. She understood, with painful clarity, exactly what the pack believed about her now. Not simply a caretaker overstepping her role by accident, but a scheming rogue who had somehow manipulated a grieving child into calling her mother, perhaps in some calculated attempt to secure a position she had no right to claim. The unfairness of it burned, but beneath the anger was something far more painful. Fear. Fear that she had, through no true fault of her own, brought unwanted trouble into Damien and Eli's lives, trouble they had not asked for, and did not deserve. She arrived at the pack house that afternoon, later than usual, having spent the morning trying to steady herself before facing Eli, uncertain of what she would even say to him about the events of the previous night. She found him in the garden, sitting alone by the pond, tossing pebbles into the water, with none of his usual enthusiasm. "Eli," she called softly, approaching slowly. He looked up, and something in his expression, a wariness she had not seen since their earliest days together, made her chest ache with fresh worry. "Are you leaving?" he asked, his small voice trembling slightly. "Nora said the other pups told her," Their parents said you might have to go away because of what happened last night. Callie's heart broke at the fear, so plainly written across his young face. She knelt down beside him at the water's edge, taking his small hands gently in hers. I am not going anywhere, unless your father asks me to, she said carefully, though even as she spoke the words, uncertainty gnawed at her. But Eli, we do need to talk about last night, about what you called me. Eli's lower lip trembled, and he looked down at his lap, suddenly finding great interest in the pebbles scattered across his palms. I did not mean to say it, he whispered. It just came out, because you take care of me the way I think a mom would. I do not really remember what my real mom was like. I only have the picture in Papa's study, but she does not feel real to me, not the way you feel real. Callie felt tears sting her own eyes at the raw honesty in his words, the simple, aching truth of a child who had lost something before he was old enough to understand what he had lost. Eli, I am not upset that you said it, she told him gently. I understand why you said it. But some of the grown-ups in the pack are worried, and worry sometimes makes people say unkind things, or think unkind thoughts, about things they do not fully understand. Is it my fault? Eli asked, his eyes filling with fresh tears. Did I make trouble for you? No, Callie said firmly, pulling him into a tight embrace. No, sweet boy, none of this is your fault. Never think that. You simply said what your heart felt, and there is nothing wrong with that. The trouble belongs to grown-ups, who have forgotten how simple, honest hearts can be. They sat together by the pond for a long while after that, Eli's small body gradually relaxing against her as his tears subsided, and Callie found herself, despite her own turmoil, grateful for the quiet comfort of simply being needed by someone who loved her without complication or condition. Inside the pack house, Damien faced a far less gentle version of the same conversation. The Alpha Council had convened an emergency meeting that afternoon, summoned by Margaret's insistence that the events of the Harvest Feast required immediate discussion before rumors spread further and damaged the pack's standing among their allies. Damien sat at the head of the long council table, his expression carefully neutral despite the irritation simmering beneath his composed exterior. The situation has become untenable, Alpha, Margaret said without preamble, her tone sharp with barely restrained frustration. Every pack within 100 miles has heard some version of what happened at the feast by now. Our allies are questioning your judgment. Lady Seraphina's family, in particular, has expressed serious concerns about the stability of Blackthorn's leadership. My judgment remains entirely sound, Damien replied evenly. A child fell and sought comfort from the person who has cared for him most closely these past months. There is nothing scandalous in that, Margaret, however much you and the council wish to manufacture a crisis from it. With respect, Alpha, you did nothing to correct him, another council member, an older wolf named Victor, added carefully. In front of the entire gathering, that silence spoke louder than any words could have, and every wolf in that hall understood it as such. Damien's jaw tightened, the memory of that silence, and the reasons behind it, still tender and unexamined, even in his own mind. He had not planned his response that night. He had simply acted on instinct, an instinct that told him correcting his grieving, comforted son in front of a room full of judgmental onlookers would have caused far more harm than any rumor the council now feared. I will not humiliate my son by publicly shaming him for expressing genuine affection, Damien said, his voice hardening with the authority that ended most arguments before they truly began. If the council wishes to discuss the future of this pack's leadership, we will do so through proper channels, not through hysteria over a child's innocent words at a family gathering. The meeting continued for another tense hour, circling the same arguments without resolution, until Damien finally ended it with a firm dismissal, leaving the council chamber with his frustration barely contained beneath his composed exterior. He found himself walking, almost without conscious decision, toward the garden, drawn by some instinct he did not fully examine, and found Callie and Eli still seated together by the pond, though Eli had finally regained enough of his usual energy to attempt another round of stone skipping. Callie rose when she saw him approaching, her expression uncertain, bracing herself for news she feared would not be good. The council is unhappy, Damien said without preamble, coming to stand beside her. They believe the situation has damaged the pack's reputation among our allies. Callie's shoulders sagged slightly, though she nodded, having expected as much. I understand, If you need to distance yourself and Eli from me, Damien, I do not wish to cause further trouble for you or for the pack." "That is not what I said," Damien replied, his tone gentler now than it had been in the council chamber. "I told them their concerns were unfounded, and that I will not make decisions about my son's well-being based on political convenience or wounded pride." Relief flickered across Callie's face, though worry still lingered beneath it. "But the whispers, Damien. The pack members already look at me differently. I saw it myself this morning, in the village." Damien's expression darkened slightly at this, anger flickering briefly in his eyes on her behalf. "The pack will adjust, Callie. Rumors fade when there is nothing further to feed them." "And if there is something further to feed them?" Callie asked quietly, her eyes searching his with a question neither of them had yet dared to voice directly. Damien did not answer immediately, the weight of unspoken possibility hanging heavily in the space between them. In the distance, Eli's delighted laughter rang out, as another pebble finally skipped successfully across the water's surface, oblivious to the quiet, complicated moment unfolding between the two adults who had, without either of them fully intending it, become the center of an unraveling storm that neither of them yet knew how to control. Callie had never spoken to anyone in Blackthorn about the night her old life ended, not even to Owen, who had shown her nothing but kindness since the day he first invited her to help with the village children. It was not a story she shared easily, and yet, as the days following the harvest feast grew heavier with unwanted attention and whispered judgment, she found the old memories surfacing more frequently than she wished, pulled up from wherever she had buried them by the sheer weight of everything happening around her now. She had been 11 years old when the attack came. Her birth pack, the Ferngrove Wolves, had lived peacefully for generations in a quiet valley, bordered by dense forest, never seeking conflict, never threatening the territories of their neighbors. But peace had not protected them from ambition. A rival alliance, hungry for the rich hunting grounds Ferngrove controlled, had struck without warning, one autumn evening, descending on the unsuspecting pack in overwhelming numbers. Callie remembered fragments of that night with painful clarity, even now, more than 15 years later. The sound of her mother's voice, sharp with terror, telling her to run and not look back. The feeling of cold mud beneath her bare feet as she fled through the darkened forest. The distant sounds of chaos behind her, growing fainter as she ran, until finally, exhausted and alone, she collapsed beneath a fallen tree and waited for dawn, too frightened to move, too devastated to fully understand what she had lost. When she finally found the courage to return to what remained of her home, there had been nothing left to find. No survivors, no pack to welcome her back, only silence, and the terrible hollow understanding that she was, from that day forward, entirely alone in the world. She had survived the years since, through sheer determination, moving from territory to territory, never staying long enough to form attachments that grief might one day take from her again. She had learned, through hard experience, that love made a person vulnerable, in ways that violence and loss could exploit without mercy. It was safer, she had told herself for years, to remain unattached, to offer kindness, without allowing herself to need anyone in return. And then she had come to Blackthorn, and met a lonely, grieving boy, who reminded her so much of herself at that age, and every careful wall she had built around her heart had begun, slowly and against her own better judgment, to crumble. She sat now in the small garden behind her cottage, the evening air cool against her skin, and allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to truly examine what she felt for Eli, and for Damien. It frightened her, the depth of it. She loved that boy as though he were her own, had loved him for weeks now if she was honest with herself. And the thought of losing him, of being forced away from Blackthorn by pack politics or fear-driven judgment, ached in a way she had not allowed herself to feel since the night she lost Ferngrove. And Damien. She was not naive enough to pretend she did not notice the way his eyes lingered on her sometimes, the gentleness that crept into his voice when he spoke to her, so different from the guarded formality he showed the rest of his pack. She recognized, too, the same careful walls in him that she carried in herself, walls built from loss, from the fear of caring too deeply and losing everything again. A knock at her cottage door interrupted her thoughts. She rose, surprised to find Owen standing on her doorstep, his expression unusually serious. "May I come in?" he asked. She nodded, stepping aside to let him enter, and he settled into the small chair near her modest hearth, declining her offer of tea with a small shake of his head. "I wanted to speak with you honestly," Owen began, "about what is happening. I know the pack's reaction to the feast has not been kind to you." "I appreciate your concern," Callie said carefully, uncertain where this conversation was heading. "Damien has not been himself since you arrived," Owen continued, watching her closely. "Not in a bad way. In the best way I have seen from him since Elena died. I have known him since we were pups together, Callie. I have watched him carry grief like armor for 3 years, refusing to let anyone close enough to lighten that weight. Until you." Callie felt her cheeks warm, uncertain how to respond to such a direct observation. "I have only tried to help him and Eli in whatever small way I could." "I know," Owen said gently. "But I think you should be prepared, Callie, for the fact that this may become about more than caretaking, if it has not already. And I think you deserve to know that whatever choice Damien makes, whatever path this takes, he will need to fight harder for it than perhaps he realizes, because the council will not simply accept this quietly. I do not wish to be the cause of conflict within his pack," Callie said, worry creasing her brow. "Perhaps it would be simpler, safer for everyone, if I stepped back, found somewhere else to go." Owen's expression sharpened slightly, a rare flash of firmness in his usually easygoing manner. "Do not run from this out of fear, Callie. I have seen what fear-driven retreat does to a person. I watched Damien do exactly that after Elena died, hiding behind duty and grief rather than facing what frightened him. Do not make the same mistake yourself." His words struck deeper than he perhaps intended, echoing thoughts she had barely allowed herself to acknowledge. She thought of Ferngrove, of the years she had spent deliberately avoiding attachment out of fear of loss, and wondered, for the first time, whether that fear had cost her more than it had ever protected her from. After Owen left, Callie remained sitting by her small hearth long into the evening, turning his words over in her mind. She thought of Eli's small hand in hers, of Damien's quiet gratitude in the garden, of the strange, fragile hope that had been building in her chest since the day she first walked through the doors of the pack house. She thought, too, of the danger such hope carried, the risk of loving deeply again, after everything she had lost. But perhaps, she thought finally, as the fire burned low and the night settled quietly around her small cottage, some things were worth the risk. Perhaps love, however frightening, was still better than the safety of a life lived entirely alone. The following days brought no easing of the pack's whispered scrutiny, but Callie found herself, despite the lingering unease, returning each morning to the pack house, with steadier resolve than before, determined not to let fear drive her away from the family that had, without her fully intending it, become the closest thing to home she had known in 15 years. Lady Seraphina arrived at the pack house exactly 1 week after the harvest feast, this time with a formal delegation from her own territory, announcing her intention to properly court Damien as a candidate for the position of Luna. The Alpha Council received her with obvious relief, several members practically beaming as they escorted her through the pack house, treating her arrival as though it might single-handedly resolve the scandal still simmering throughout Blackthorn's territory. Damien greeted her with the polite formality expected of him, though every instinct in him rebelled against the transparent political maneuvering behind her visit. He understood the game well enough. Seraphina's family sought the alliance, and influence a Luna position would bring, and the council, desperate to restore what they viewed as proper order after weeks of unwanted scandal, had all but rolled out a welcome banner in her honor. "I thought perhaps we might walk together this afternoon," Seraphina suggested during the formal welcome dinner that evening, her hand finding his arm with practiced familiarity. "It would be good for the pack to see us together, do you not think? To reassure them that Blackthorn's future remains stable." Damien's jaw tightened at the calculated phrasing, the not-so-subtle reminder that his own leadership had been called into question by the events of the past week. "I have obligations to attend to this evening," he said, keeping his tone carefully neutral. "Of course," Seraphina replied smoothly, though something sharp flickered briefly in her eyes. "Perhaps tomorrow, then. I understand you have a young son. I would very much like to meet him properly. Children respond well to me, you know. I have quite a way with them." The comment, innocent on its surface, carried an unmistakable edge, a clear reference to the scandal her visit had been arranged around. Damien said nothing, though his displeasure was evident in the sudden coolness of his expression, and Serafina, sensing she had perhaps overstepped, quickly redirected the conversation toward safer topics of alliance and territory. Over the following days, Serafina made a concerted effort to insert herself into every aspect of pack life, attending council meetings, touring the training grounds, and making pointed inquiries about Eli's schedule that Damien found increasingly difficult to deflect gracefully. She was, he had to admit, skilled in the arts of pack politics, weaving herself into conversations and decisions with practiced ease, building support among the council members who saw in her exactly the proper, pedigreed Luna candidate they had been seeking for years. But beneath her polished charm, Damien sensed something colder, something calculating, that made his instincts wary despite the political convenience her courtship represented. He found himself, more than once, comparing her carefully composed warmth to the genuine, unguarded kindness Callie showed toward Eli and everyone else in the pack, and the comparison did not favor Serafina in the slightest. Matters came to a head one afternoon when Serafina, arriving unannounced at the pack house, found Eli in the garden with Callie. The two of them engaged in an animated lesson about identifying different types of leaves scattered across the autumn ground. Serafina approached with a bright, practiced smile, kneeling down beside Eli with theatrical warmth. "What a clever boy you are," she said, examining the small collection of leaves he had gathered. "Would you like to show me around the pack house, Eli? I would love to get to know you better." Eli glanced uncertainly at Callie before answering, his young instincts clearly wary of the unfamiliar woman's sudden attention. "I am busy right now," he said politely, if somewhat stiffly. "Callie is teaching me about leaves." "I am sure Callie would not mind sharing you for just a little while," Serafina pressed, her smile never wavering despite the obvious rebuff, reaching out to take his small hand. Eli pulled back instinctively, stepping closer to Callie's side. "I want to stay here," he said firmly, and something in Serafina's expression flickered, brief and cold, before she smoothly recovered her pleasant composure. "Of course," she said lightly, rising to her feet and brushing non-existent dust from her elegant dress. "Another time, perhaps." She departed with a final, measuring glance toward Callie, one that carried no warmth at all beneath its polite surface, and Callie, watching her go, felt a distinct chill settle over the afternoon, despite the warm autumn sun. That evening, Damien found Callie in the garden long after Eli had been put to bed, sitting alone on the small stone bench near the pond, her expression troubled in the fading light. "Is something wrong?" he asked, settling onto the bench beside her. Callie hesitated before answering, uncertain whether voicing her concerns overstepped whatever boundaries remained between them. "Lady Serafina visited the garden today," she said finally. She tried to draw Eli away to spend time with her. He did not want to go. Damien's expression darkened slightly, though he was not entirely surprised. "She has been making efforts to establish herself as a suitable Luna candidate this past week. I imagine winning Eli's favor is part of that strategy." "I do not trust her," Callie admitted quietly. "There is something beneath her charm that feels calculated, cold, even." "I have noticed the same," Damien said, surprising her with his honesty. "The council favors her, of course. Proper lineage, powerful family alliances, everything tradition demands of a Luna. But I find myself, despite every practical argument in her favor, entirely unable to feel anything toward her beyond polite obligation." Callie's heart quickened at his words, though she carefully kept her expression neutral, uncertain what to make of such an admission. "The council will continue pressuring you, though, especially after what happened at the feast." "Let them pressure," Damien said, his voice firm with quiet resolve. "I have spent 3 years allowing duty and grief to dictate every decision in my life. I find I am growing tired of it, Callie. I find myself wanting, for the first time in a very long while, to choose based on what actually feels right, rather than what tradition demands." The weight of his words hung heavily in the cooling evening air between them, and Callie, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear she barely dared to examine, found herself unable to look away from the quiet intensity in his gaze. Neither of them spoke further that evening, the unspoken understanding between them deepening in the comfortable silence. But both of them carried the conversation with them long after they parted ways, each wondering, privately, where this fragile, growing connection might eventually lead. The autumn hunt was a tradition nearly as old as the Blackthorn pack itself, a gathering of the strongest warriors each year to track and bring down a portion of the season's game before winter settled fully over the territory. It was as much ceremony as practical necessity, a chance for the pack's fighters to demonstrate their strength, and for the Alpha King to lead his people, quite literally, from the front. Seraphina had requested, through Margaret, to be permitted to observe the hunt from the ceremonial viewing point near the northern ridge, a request the council had happily granted, viewing it as another opportunity to strengthen the growing narrative of her suitability as Blackthorn's future Luna. Damien had agreed, if only because refusing would have created more political friction than he currently had patience to manage. The hunt began at dawn, the pack's strongest wolves shifting into their true forms and moving through the misty forest with the coordinated grace of warriors who had trained together for years. Damien ran at the head of the pack, his black wolf form cutting through the undergrowth with powerful, controlled strides, every sense heightened and focused entirely on the task at hand. It was nearly midday when the hunt concluded successfully, the pack's efforts rewarded with enough game to last well into the coming winter months. As the wolves began shifting back into human form, near the northern ridge, to rest before the journey home, Seraphina descended from the viewing platform to congratulate Damien on the successful hunt, her hand resting familiarly against his bare arm as she offered her praise. The reaction was immediate and violent. Damien's wolf, still simmering close beneath the surface from the intensity of the hunt, recoiled sharply at her touch, an instinctive growl rumbling low in his throat before he could fully suppress it. Seraphina snatched her hand back, startled, her carefully composed expression cracking into genuine surprise. "Forgive me," Damien said quickly, forcing his tense muscles to relax, though the unsettled feeling in his chest did not fade nearly as easily as his outward composure. The hunt leaves the wolf close to the surface. It is not always safe to touch an alpha so soon after. Seraphina accepted the explanation with a stiff nod, though her eyes carried a flicker of something colder now, calculation mixed with wounded pride. She excused herself shortly after, claiming fatigue from the journey, and Damien, left standing alone near the edge of the clearing, found himself deeply unsettled by his wolf's violent reaction. It was not simply exhaustion from the hunt, he realized slowly. His wolf had reacted to her touch specifically, some deep, primal instinct rejecting her proximity, in a way it had never rejected anyone else's, not even strangers or rivals he had faced in genuine conflict. He had felt this kind of instinctive rejection only once before in his life, years ago, before he had properly understood what it meant, in the earliest days of recognizing Elena as his true mate. The realization settled over him slowly, heavy and undeniable. His wolf was rejecting Seraphina not out of simple unfamiliarity, but because some deeper instinct had already recognized someone else, someone whose presence, whose touch, would not provoke such violent rejection. He thought immediately of Callie. The pack began their journey back toward the main territory shortly after, and Damien found himself, throughout the long walk home, unable to fully quiet the racing thoughts now consuming his mind. He had told himself, for weeks now, that his growing feelings toward Callie were simply gratitude, simply the natural warmth that came from watching someone care so gently for his son. But his wolf's reaction to Seraphina's touch, the stark, undeniable rejection, compared to the easy calm he felt whenever Callie was near, suggested something far deeper than gratitude alone. He remembered, then, something Owen had mentioned to him once, years ago, in passing conversation about pack lore. The old stories spoke of second-chance bonds, rare occurrences where a wolf who had lost their true mate might, under certain circumstances, form a new bond with another soul, whose spirit resonated with their own in a similarly profound way. Such bonds were viewed with suspicion by traditionalists, who considered the true mate bond sacred and unrepeatable, but the old stories insisted such connections, though rare, were entirely real, and every bit as powerful as the original bond they followed. Damien had dismissed such stories as folklore in the years since Elena's death, never imagining he would find himself considering their truth so seriously. But standing now at the edge of the northern territory, his wolf still humming with quiet unrest from Seraphina's unwelcome touch, and quiet, steady calm, at the mere thought of Callie, he found himself unable to dismiss the possibility any longer. That evening, he sought out Owen in the pack house's private study, finding his old friend reviewing reports by candlelight. "I need to ask you something," Damien said without preamble, closing the door behind him. About second-chance bonds, the old stories you once mentioned. Owen looked up, surprise evident on his face at the unexpected question, though something knowing quickly replaced it. What has happened? Damien explained, as carefully and honestly as he could, the events of the hunt, his wolf's violent rejection of Seraphina's touch, and the quiet, unmistakable calm he felt whenever Callie was near. Owen listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious as the explanation unfolded. I have long suspected something was building between you and Callie, Owen said finally, once Damien had finished. I did not wish to say so directly, knowing how carefully you have guarded yourself since Elena's death. But what you described, Damien, the wolf's rejection compared to its calm, that is not simple preference. That sounds very much like the beginnings of exactly what the old stories describe. The council will not accept it easily, Damien said, running a hand through his hair, the weight of the realization settling heavily over him. A second-chance bond, and with a rogue wolf no less. They will call it scandal, weakness, an insult to Elena's memory. Perhaps, Owen acknowledged, but Damien, listen to me carefully. You have spent 3 years punishing yourself for surviving Elena's death, as though loving again somehow betrays her memory. It does not. Elena would have wanted you to find happiness again, for your own sake, and for Eli's sake most of all. If your wolf has truly recognized something real in Callie, do not let fear of tradition, or fear of dishonoring the past, keep you from a future that might finally bring you and your son genuine peace. Damien sat in heavy silence for a long while after Owen's words, staring into the flickering candlelight, his mind turning over months of small moments, Callie's gentle laughter, her quiet wisdom about grief, the way Eli had thrived under her patient care, the strange, undeniable peace he felt whenever she was near. He thought of the word Eli had spoken so innocently at the harvest feast, a word Damien had refused to correct not out of simple parental leniency, but because some deep, unexamined part of him had wanted, even then, for it to be true. He rose from his chair with new, quiet resolve settling over him, though he knew the path ahead would not be simple. The council would resist. Seraphina's family would view any rejection as insult, and Callie herself, guarded by her own painful history, might not be ready to accept what his wolf had already recognized as truth. But for the first time in 3 long years, Damien found himself willing to face whatever difficulty lay ahead, rather than retreating behind the safe, familiar walls of grief and duty that had defined his life for far too long. The morning began ordinarily enough, sunlight filtering softly through the garden trees as Eli chased a small rabbit that had wandered too close to the pond, his laughter ringing bright and carefree across the grounds, while Callie watched from a nearby bench, mending a small tear in one of his jackets. Neither of them noticed, at first, the 2 unfamiliar figures moving quietly along the tree line at the edge of the property, watching the young heir with calculated patience. Seraphina's rejection at the hunt had not been received quietly within her own household. Her family, ambitious and unwilling to accept the loss of an alliance they had worked years to secure, had grown desperate as word reached them of Damien's cooling interest and the persistent rumors surrounding his growing attachment to Eli's rogue caretaker. Desperation, in ambitious hands, often turned to dangerous schemes, and the plan set into motion that morning had been designed with cold, calculated precision, aimed at discrediting Callie so thoroughly that no one, not even Damien, could continue defending her presence within the pack. The 2 rogue wolves hired for the task waited until Callie's attention drifted, focused on her mending, before slipping silently through the garden's edge toward Eli, who had chased his small rabbit friend well beyond the safety of the open lawn and into the thicker brush near the property's boundary. Callie looked up moments later, an instinctive unease prickling at the back of her neck, and found the garden unnervingly quiet, Eli's cheerful chatter conspicuously absent. She rose immediately, calling his name, her voice sharpening with alarm when no answer came. Eli, she called again, dropping the mending and moving quickly toward the tree line where she had last seen him. Her wolf senses, honed by years of survival instinct, picked up the faint, wrong scent of strangers layered beneath the familiar woodland smells, and her heart lurched violently in her chest. She broke into a full run, following the disturbed underbrush deeper into the trees, and found them within moments, Two rogue wolves in human form attempting to force a struggling, terrified Eli toward the property's outer wall. The boy was fighting with everything his small body possessed, kicking and twisting against the man who held him, his cries muffled by a rough hand clamped over his mouth. Callie did not hesitate. Years of survival instinct, honed since the night she lost everything at Ferngrove, surged forward with fierce, protective clarity. She shifted mid-stride, her human form dissolving into a lean, powerful wolf that moved with startling speed, closing the distance before either rogue fully registered her approach. She struck the man holding Eli with the full force of her charge, knocking him away from the boy and sending him sprawling across the forest floor. Eli, suddenly freed, stumbled backward with a frightened cry, and Callie positioned herself immediately between him and the two attackers, her hackles raised, a low, warning growl rumbling deep in her chest. The second rogue lunged at her, and Callie met the attack head-on, her teeth finding purchase against his shoulder as they grappled fiercely across the underbrush, snarls, and the sounds of violent struggle filling the once peaceful clearing. She fought with desperate, focused ferocity, every instinct in her screaming to protect the child cowering wide-eyed behind her, and though the rogue was larger and stronger, her sheer determination gave her an edge his mercenary indifference could not match. The first attacker recovered and rejoined the fight, and for several harrowing moments, Callie found herself fending off two opponents at once, taking a painful gash along her flank from a glancing bite, before finally managing to drive both rogues back with a series of savage, well-placed strikes. Her wolf, smaller than either attacker but fueled by fierce protective instinct, refused to yield ground, refused to allow either of them another chance to reach the terrified boy behind her. The commotion had not gone unnoticed. Damien, working in his study when Eli's earlier cries reached the edge of his awareness through the mate bond he had only recently begun to understand, felt a spike of pure terror lance through his chest, an instinct far stronger than mere fatherly concern. He was moving before conscious thought fully caught up with instinct, shifting mid-sprint and tearing through the packhouse grounds with a speed born of desperate urgency. He arrived at the clearing just as the two rogues, finally recognizing the fight as unwinnable against Callie's relentless defense and the sound of approaching reinforcements, turned to flee into the deeper forest. Damien's black wolf form crashed through the underbrush with terrifying speed, and though his instincts screamed to pursue the fleeing attackers, one look at Callie, bleeding and exhausted, but still standing protectively over his trembling son, redirected every ounce of his focus immediately. He shifted back to human form, rushing to Eli first, gathering his sobbing son into his arms, and checking desperately for injuries beyond the obvious fright. Eli clung to him, shaking violently, but otherwise unharmed thanks entirely to Callie's fierce, unhesitating intervention. "Callie," Damien said, his voice tight with residual fear, as he turned to find her still in wolf form, breathing heavily, blood matting the fur along her side. "You are hurt." She shifted back slowly, wincing at the movement, and Damien was at her side instantly, one arm still holding Eli close, while the other steadied her, as her legs threatened to buckle beneath the combined weight of exhaustion and pain. "I am all right," Callie managed, though her voice was strained with obvious effort. "Eli, is he?" "He is safe," Damien assured her quickly. "Because of you." More warriors arrived moments later, summoned by the earlier commotion, and Damien quickly organized a search party to track the fleeing attackers, while healers rushed forward to tend to Callie's injuries. She protested weakly that Eli's well-being mattered more than her own scrapes, but Damien would not hear of it, insisting she be examined and treated immediately, his hand refusing to leave hers throughout the healer's careful work. As evening settled over the packhouse, Eli finally calm and sleeping soundly beside Callie's healing bed, refusing to be separated from her even for a moment after the day's terror, Damien sat quietly at her bedside, watching her rest, his heart still heavy with the horror of what might have happened had she not acted with such fearless, immediate courage. "You saved him," Damien said softly, once Callie stirred and opened her eyes, finding him still seated beside her in the quiet, candle-lit room, without hesitation, without a moment's thought for your own safety. "He is mine to protect," Callie said simply, her voice still weak, but her conviction unmistakable. "Whatever anyone else believes about my place here, Damien, I could never have stood by and let harm come to that boy. Not for a single moment." Damien's throat tightened with emotion he no longer wished to suppress or hide, and he reached out, gently taking her hand in both of his. "I know," he said quietly. "I know exactly what he means to you, because I know now, without any doubt remaining, what you mean to me as well." The investigation that followed uncovered, within days, the connection between the attackers and Serafina's household, evidence damning enough that even the most stubborn members of the Alpha Council could no longer defend her candidacy or dismiss the danger her family's ambition had brought upon the Pack's most vulnerable member. Serafina and her delegation departed Blackthorn territory in disgraced silence before the week's end, her hopes for alliance and Luna position destroyed entirely by her own family's desperate, reckless scheme. But for Damien, watching Callie slowly recover over the following days, her protective courage having proven beyond any doubt exactly what kind of heartbeat within her, the events of that terrifying afternoon had crystallized something he could no longer deny or delay. Whatever remained of his careful hesitation, whatever fear of tradition or council disapproval had held him back until now, had burned away entirely in the fierce, undeniable truth of watching her fight, without hesitation, to protect the family that had somehow, quietly and completely, become his entire world. Callie's recovery took nearly a full week, the wound along her side healing steadily under the careful attention of the Pack's healers, though the deeper ache of everything the attack had stirred within her took considerably longer to settle. She spent much of that week in a quiet guest room within the Pack house itself, insisted upon by Damien, despite her protests, that her own cottage would suffice, and Eli visited faithfully every single day, curling up beside her with picture books and small drawings he had made especially to help her feel better. It was during one of these quiet afternoons, with Eli finally sent off for his afternoon rest, under Owen's watchful supervision, that Damien came to sit beside her bed, his expression carrying a seriousness that immediately drew her full attention. "There is something I need to tell you," he began, his voice steady, despite the vulnerability evident in his eyes. "Something I should have said before now, but fear kept me silent longer than I am proud to admit." Callie set aside the book she had been reading, giving him her complete attention, sensing the weight behind his words. "What is it, Damien?" He took a breath, gathering the courage that had carried him through countless battles and difficult decisions as Alpha, yet somehow felt harder to summon now, facing this particular truth. "The day of the hunt, when Serafina touched my arm, my wolf reacted violently. Rejected her completely, in a way I have not experienced since before Elena. I did not understand it at first, but Owen helped me recognize what it meant. My wolf has bonded to you, Callie, not simply out of gratitude for your care of Eli, but as something far deeper, a second chance bond, the old stories call it. Rare, but entirely real." Callie's breath caught, her heart pounding, as she absorbed the weight of his confession. "Damien, let me finish," he said gently, taking her hand in his. "I do not say this to frighten you, or to pressure you into feeling something you do not feel yourself. I say it because I have spent 3 years believing I owed my grief permanent loyalty, believing that loving again somehow betrayed Elena's memory. But watching you fight for Eli, watching the fierce, selfless courage in you, I understand now that grief and love are not enemies. Elena would want this for me, for us. I do not want you to be simply Eli's caretaker anymore, Callie. I want you as my mate, as his mother, not by mistake or accident, but as truth." Tears filled Callie's eyes, a mixture of overwhelming emotion she had not allowed herself to fully feel in years. "Damien, I want that too, more than I have wanted anything in a very long time. But I am afraid. Every time I have loved deeply, I have lost everything. My pack, my family, everyone I ever cared for was taken from me. If I allow myself to love you, to love Eli, as fully as my heart already does, and something happens, I do not know if I could survive losing that again." Damien moved closer, cupping her face gently in his hands. "I cannot promise you a life without pain, Callie. No one can promise such a thing, but I can promise you that I will fight for this, for you, for our family, with everything I have. I already lost someone I loved once, and I understand the fear of losing again more deeply than most. But hiding from love did not heal that wound. It only kept me frozen, unable to fully live, unable to fully be the father Eli deserved. I do not want to live that way any longer, and I do not think you truly want to either." Callie closed her eyes, leaning into his gentle touch, the walls she had carried for 15 years, trembling under the weight of everything she felt for this man and his son. "I am frightened," she whispered honestly. "But I think, perhaps, I am more frightened of losing what we could have by refusing to try, than I am of the pain that might come from trying." Before Damien could respond, a small voice interrupted from the doorway, and both of them turned to find Eli standing there, having apparently slipped away from his supervised rest, his expression earnest and hopeful in the way only a child's could be. "Are you going to stay forever now?" he asked Callie directly, padding into the room in his soft sleeping clothes. "Not just because I said the wrong word by accident, but because you want to?" Callie's heart ached at the simple, direct honesty of his question, and she opened her arms, and Eli climbed immediately into the bed beside her, settling comfortably against her side, as though he belonged there entirely. "I want to stay," Callie said softly, meeting Eli's hopeful gaze, and then Damien's steady, warm one. "Not by mistake, Eli. Because I love you. Because I love your father. Because somewhere along the way, without either of us fully realizing it, this became exactly where I belong." Eli's face broke into a bright, unguarded smile, the kind of pure childhood joy that had been rare in the pack house for far too long. "So I can call you Mom for real now? Not by accident?" "For real," Callie confirmed, her voice thick with emotion as she pressed a gentle kiss to the top of his head. "Forever, if you will have me." "I will have you forever," Eli declared with the absolute certainty only a child could offer, wrapping his small arms tightly around her, and Damien, watching the two people who had, together, healed something in him he had believed permanently broken, felt his own eyes grow damp with emotion he no longer wished to hide. The days that followed brought a formal announcement to the pack, delivered not with hesitation or apology, but with the full authority and confidence of an alpha king who had finally, fully claimed the happiness he deserved. The council, chastened by the scandal of Seraphina's family's desperate scheme, and witness to the undeniable courage Callie had shown in protecting the young heir, offered far less resistance than Damien had once feared, though a formal ceremony would still be required to properly recognize her as Blackthorn's Luna, in the eyes of pack tradition. Margaret, ever the traditionalist, still voiced quiet reservations about a rogue wolf assuming such an important position, but even she could not deny, after witnessing Callie's fierce protection of Eli, and the genuine transformation in Damien's demeanor since her arrival, that something rare and powerful had taken root within the pack house, something that could not be dismissed, simply because it defied convention. As preparations began for the formal claiming ceremony that would announce Callie as Damien's true mate and Luna before the entire pack, Callie found herself standing once more in the garden where everything had begun, watching Eli chase autumn leaves across the lawn with unrestrained joy, and felt, for the first time since the night she lost Ferngrove so many years ago, that she had finally, truly, found her way home. The great hall of Blackthorn had been transformed once again, this time not for a simple harvest celebration, but for the formal claiming ceremony that would announce Callie Reyes as the true mate and Luna of Alpha King Damien Ashford, before the assembled might of the entire pack. Every corner of the hall gleamed with polished silver and fresh white flowers, a stark and deliberate contrast to the autumn feast months before, when whispers and judgment had filled these same walls with quiet cruelty. Callie stood in a small preparation room adjacent to the hall, her hands trembling slightly as Nora, a kind pack member who had become a close friend over the preceding months, helped fasten the final clasps of her formal ceremonial dress, deep blue silk embroidered with silver thread, that caught the candlelight with every small movement. "You look beautiful," Nora said warmly, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "The whole pack is waiting, Callie. Every single person who once doubted you is out there right now, ready to watch you claim exactly the place you have earned." Callie managed a nervous smile, smoothing the front of her dress with hands that had faced down two hostile attackers without hesitation, yet trembled now at the thought of standing before her entire adopted pack. "I never imagined this moment would come," she admitted quietly. "Not after losing everything so young. I told myself for years that this kind of belonging was not meant for someone like me. And yet here you are," Nora said gently, squeezing her hand, "belonging exactly where you were always meant to be." A soft knock interrupted them, and Eli poked his head through the door, dressed in a small formal outfit that mirrored his father's, his hair combed neatly, though a few stubborn curls had already begun to escape their careful arrangement. His face lit up the moment he saw Callie. "You look like a queen," he said with wide-eyed wonder, rushing forward to hug her carefully around the waist, mindful of her formal dress. "I feel a bit nervous, if I am honest," Callie confessed, kneeling down to meet his eyes properly. "Do not be nervous," Eli said with the earnest confidence only a child could offer. "Everyone already loves you, even the grumpy council lady. She told Papa last week that she was wrong about you, and that she is glad you are staying forever." Callie laughed softly, some of her nervous tension easing at his simple, heartfelt reassurance. "Well then, I suppose I have nothing left to fear." The doors to the great hall opened moments later, and Callie walked through them, with Eli's small hand held firmly in hers, her chin lifted with quiet dignity, despite the flutter of nerves still dancing in her chest. The hall fell silent as she entered, every eye turning toward her, and this time, unlike the harvest feast so many months before, the silence carried no judgment, no cold speculation. It carried only anticipation, and in many faces scattered throughout the crowd, genuine warmth. Damien stood waiting at the front of the hall, dressed in formal ceremonial attire befitting an Alpha King, and the moment his eyes found hers across the crowded room, every trace of remaining nervousness melted away beneath the steady, unwavering warmth of his gaze. She walked toward him slowly, Eli walking proudly beside her, and the entire pack watched in respectful silence as father and son, and the woman who had healed them both, came together at last before the gathered witnesses of Blackthorn. Victor, serving as the ceremony's officiant, given his standing among the eldest and most respected of the pack elders, stepped forward as Callie reached the front of the hall, his expression solemn with the weight of tradition, though warmth had replaced the skepticism he had once carried toward her. "Alpha King Damien Ashford," Victor began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "Do you claim this woman, Callie Reyes, as your true mate and Luna, before this pack, and before the ancient bonds that guide us all?" "I do," Damien said, his voice steady and filled with quiet, absolute certainty, without hesitation, and without regret. "Callie Reyes," Victor continued, turning to her, "do you accept this claim, and do you accept the responsibilities and honor of standing as Luna to the Blackthorn pack, protector and guide, alongside your Alpha?" Callie's eyes moved briefly to Eli, standing proudly beside her, and then to Damien, whose steady gaze held nothing but complete devotion, and she felt the last remnants of 15 years of careful, protective distance dissolve entirely. "I do," she said, her voice clear and unwavering despite the emotion thick in her throat, "with my whole heart, and for as long as I am given to give it." The formal bond was sealed with the traditional exchange of the mating mark, a gentle but significant gesture performed before the entire assembly, and as Damien and Callie completed the ancient ritual, a warm, golden light seemed to pulse briefly between them, visible to every wolf in the hall, the unmistakable, undeniable confirmation of a true and sacred bond, recognized by nature itself. Gasps of wonder rippled through the crowd, even the most skeptical council members unable to deny the plain evidence of what they were witnessing. Eli, unable to contain his excitement any longer, rushed forward the moment the ceremony concluded, wrapping his arms around both of them at once. "Now you are really, truly my mom," he declared loudly, his voice carrying easily through the hall, drawing warm, delighted laughter from the assembled crowd. "Not by mistake, for real, forever." "For real, forever," Callie repeated, lifting him easily into her arms, tears of pure happiness slipping freely down her cheeks now, no longer held back by fear or uncertainty. Damien wrapped his arms around them both, drawing his newly claimed family close, and looked out over the hall filled with his pack, people who had once doubted, once whispered judgment, now standing together in genuine celebration of the family that had, against every obstacle placed before it, finally found its way to wholeness. "3 years ago," Damien said, his voice carrying clearly across the hall, quieting the celebratory murmur, "I believed I had lost everything worth living for. I built walls around my heart, told myself duty alone was enough to carry me and my son through the years ahead. I was wrong." He looked down at Eli, still held securely in Callie's arms, then met Callie's eyes with open, unashamed devotion. It took a woman with no pack of her own to remind an entire kingdom what family truly means. Not lineage, not tradition, simply love, freely given, and fiercely protected. The hall erupted into genuine cheers, warm and unrestrained, a stark and beautiful contrast to the cold silence that had once filled these same walls. Even Margaret, standing near the front of the assembly, wiped unexpected tears from her eyes, her earlier reservations entirely dissolved by the undeniable truth of what she had witnessed. Later that evening, as the celebration continued around them, music and laughter filling the great hall long into the night, Damien found a quiet moment to steal Callie away to the same garden where their story had first begun, where a lonely little boy had once taught a nervous rogue wolf how to skip stones across still water. They stood together beneath the stars, Eli finally tired enough to be persuaded into bed by Owen's patient encouragement, and Damien pulled Callie gently into his arms, resting his chin softly against the top of her head. "Do you regret any of it?" he asked quietly. "The whispers, the danger, the difficult path that brought us here?" Callie considered the question seriously, thinking of the fear and uncertainty of the months behind them, the painful memories of everything she had once lost, and the fierce, unexpected love that had grown despite every wall she had once built against it. "No," she said finally, turning in his arms to meet his eyes beneath the star-scattered sky. "Every difficult step led exactly here, to this family, to this home I never thought I would find again. I would walk through every one of those difficult days again, gladly, if it meant arriving at this same beautiful ending." Above them, the stars shone bright and steady, the same stars Callie had once told a grieving little boy were made from wishes that never truly went out. And standing together in that quiet garden, surrounded by the family they had built from unexpected beginnings and undeniable love, Damien, Callie, and Eli finally had everything that fractured hearts had once believed impossible to find again. A home, a family, and a love that had never, from that very first accidental word spoken in a crowded hall, truly been a mistake at all.